The first mistake Corporal Ryan Miller made was thinking the old man had come to beg. Thomas Whitaker arrived at Fort Holden's Gate 3 at 6:17 on a cold Tuesday morning, when the sky was still the color of dull steel and the wind pushed dry leaves across the asphalt in thin, scraping lines. Gate 3 was not the ceremonial entrance. No flags hung over polished stone there. No visitors took pictures beside brass plaques. It was a service gate, used by maintenance trucks, fuel deliveries, and contractors who knew to keep their badges high and their answers short. Thomas came on foot. He was 72, white, lean in the shoulders, with a slow walk that made younger men underestimate him before he ever opened his mouth. His olive field jacket had faded at the seams. His boots were clean but old, the leather creased from years of honest use. In both hands, he carried a small wooden box wrapped in a gray cloth and held close against his chest, as if the wind itself had no right to touch it. Corporal Miller stepped out from the guard shack before Thomas reached the yellow line. Miller was 26, white, square-jawed, and sharp in the way young soldiers sometimes are when they have just enough authority to confuse procedure with wisdom. His uniform was pressed. His gloves were new. His eyes went first to the jacket, then the boots, then the box. "Sir, this gate is restricted," Miller said. "State your business." Thomas stopped exactly 3 feet from the painted line. Not 2. Not 4. 3. Sergeant Emily Carter noticed that from inside the shack, though she did not know yet why it mattered. Thomas lifted his chin slightly. "I need to see General Harrington." Miller gave a short laugh through his nose, the kind meant to be heard by the other guard behind him. "You and half the county. Do you have an appointment?" "No, a sponsor." "No, a current base pass." Thomas reached into his jacket and removed a worn veteran identification card, its edges softened by time. Miller took it between 2 fingers like it had been left out in the rain. He walked to the scanner mounted beside the shack window and slid it under the reader. The machine chirped once, then flashed red. "Access denied." Miller looked back at Thomas with the faintest curve of a smile. "That's a problem." Thomas said nothing. The wind lifted the corner of the gray cloth around the box. For 1 second, Emily saw dark wood beneath it, polished by age, with a shallow scar cut across the grain. Miller tried the card again. The same red light blinked. This time another message appeared on the small screen, one Miller had never seen at a gate post. "Record sealed." He frowned, then tapped the screen as if the machine had made a personal mistake. "That's not normal," the second guard muttered. Miller stiffened. "Probably expired data." He turned back to Thomas. "Sir, where did you get this card?" Thomas's eyes did not move from the base beyond the fence. "It was issued to me." "When, 1985? Miller said, and the second guard laughed under his breath. Thomas let the joke pass over him. He looked past Miller, past the barrier arm, past the razor wire humming softly in the morning wind. Somewhere inside the base, a bugle call drifted faintly through a loudspeaker, thin and metallic, swallowed by the open air. Thomas's right thumb pressed once against the cloth-covered box. It was the only sign that he had heard it. Miller saw the motion and pointed at the box. "What's in there?" "Something for General Harrington." "I'll need to inspect it." No, the word was calm. Not loud. Not defiant. Just final. Miller's expression changed. Around them, the air seemed to tighten. A pickup truck rolled to a stop behind Thomas, its contractor driver watching through the windshield. The second guard shifted his weight. Emily stepped closer to the doorway. Miller lowered his voice, but not enough. "Sir, you don't walk up to a United States Army installation with a sealed record, no appointment, and a mystery box, then tell security no." Thomas looked at him then. His eyes were pale blue, steady, and tired in a way sleep could never fix. "I understand security." Miller mistook the quiet for weakness. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, you don't look like someone who belongs here. Thomas did not answer. A loose chain tapped against the flagpole beside the shack. Click. 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 Emily felt the rhythm crawl under her skin. Miller held out his hand. The box. Thomas kept both hands on it. Only General Harrington. Miller stepped closer, crossing the space between them with the confidence of a man who believed the uniform made him larger than he was. Listen carefully. We get people here all the time claiming they served. Some want attention. Some want access. Some just want a story to tell at a diner. So until I can verify who you are, you're not a veteran to me. You're a security concern. The words landed hard enough that even the second guard stopped smiling. Thomas lowered his eyes for a moment, not in shame, but as if placing something heavy back where it belonged. Then he looked at Miller again. Son, I didn't come here to be believed. Miller reached for his radio. Then why did you come? Thomas glanced once toward the flag, where the first line of sunlight struck the stripes and turned them bright against the gray morning. To return what your base forgot. Emily Carter stepped fully out of the guard shack then, her gaze fixed not on Thomas's face, but on the bottom corner of the wooden box where the cloth had slipped just enough to reveal 3 carved words, Raven 6. Dak Ridge. Sergeant Emily Carter saw the words before Miller did, and for a moment the cold morning seemed to narrow around that small strip of exposed wood. Raven 6. Dak Ridge. The letters were not painted. They were carved by hand, shallow and uneven, the way a man cuts memory into something because paper can burn and records can disappear. Emily had served long enough to know the difference between decoration and weight. This was not a souvenir from a surplus store. This was not something bought from a roadside antique booth. The box looked plain, almost rough, but it carried itself like a locked room. Corporal, Emily said quietly. Miller did not turn. He still had his radio halfway to his mouth, his eyes fixed on Thomas Whitaker as if the old man might crumble under another order. Sir, set the box on the inspection table. Thomas remained still. His hands did not tighten. His shoulders did not rise. He simply stood with that slow, immovable calm. That made the entire gate feel strangely small. The contractor in the pickup behind him leaned closer to his windshield. A fuel truck idled 20 yards back, its diesel engine ticking low in the morning air. Beyond the fence, Fort Holden was waking up. Doors closing. Tires on gravel. A distant cadence call fading between buildings. Miller heard all of it as routine. Thomas seemed to hear something underneath it. Emily saw his eyes move once to the left, to the mirror above the gate arm, then to the shadow of the guard shack, then back to Miller. Not nervous. Measuring. I said set it down, Miller repeated. No, Thomas said again. Miller let out a hard breath. You are making this worse for yourself. Thomas looked at him with no anger at all. I have had worse mornings. The second guard gave a small laugh, but it died when Emily stepped beside Miller. Let me see the card. Miller frowned. Sergeant, I have it handled. Let me see it. Her voice was calm, but the rank inside it was not optional. Miller handed her the veteran identification card. Emily turned it over in her gloved hand. The plastic was old, but not fake. The lamination had yellowed at the edges. The name was clear, Thomas E. Whitaker. The birth date matched the age. The service branch was correct. But one line near the bottom had been scraped almost smooth by time, leaving only the ghost of a unit designation. Emily moved closer to the scanner. She ran the card again. Red light. Access denied. Then the second message appeared. Record sealed. She did not tap the screen. She did not blame the machine. She just stared at the words, and a quiet pressure moved through her chest. Records were expired. Records were incomplete. Records were misfiled. But sealed was different. Sealed meant someone had decided the past still had a lock on it. "Where did you serve, Mr. Whitaker?" Emily asked. Miller rolled his eyes. "Sergeant, he is not going to answer that." Thomas turned his gaze to her. For the first time, his voice softened by a fraction. "A long way from here." "What unit?" The wind moved the gray cloth again. The carved words showed more clearly now. "Dak Ridge." Thomas lowered his eyes to the box. "One that does not exist on your screen." Miller gave a sharp little smile. "Convenient." Emily shot him a look, but Miller was already too deep into his own certainty to climb out gracefully. He stepped closer to Thomas and lifted his chin. "You know what this looks like? It looks like an old man walking up to a restricted gate with a dramatic story and a box he refuses to open. We get fake veterans. We get men who memorize a few terms, buy a jacket, scratch up an old card, and expect people to clap." The words hung in the air. This time no one laughed. Thomas did not blink. His face stayed composed, but something in the silence around him changed. It was not fear. It was not embarrassment. It was distance. As if Miller had stepped into a room where he did not understand the photographs on the wall. Emily felt it. The second guard felt it. Even the contractor in the truck stopped moving. Miller pushed on, mistaking silence for surrender. "So unless you want this morning to end with a formal detention, you will place that box on the table and admit what you are really doing here." Thomas took a slow breath through his nose. His eyes drifted past Miller to the flag over Gate 3. The chain struck the pole again. Click. 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 When he spoke, his voice was low enough that everyone leaned in without meaning to. "Young man, I did not come here for applause. I came because a promise kept too late is still better than a promise buried." Emily looked down at the card again. Thomas E. Whitaker. Then at the box. Raven 6. Dak Ridge. Her memory caught on something from the main administration building, a shadow box near the second-floor conference room, one she had passed 100 times without reading carefully. A faded photograph. A missing citation. A small brass plate with 2 words etched beneath frosted glass, "Classified Valor." She turned toward the guard shack. "Miller, step back." "Sergeant." "Now." Miller's jaw tightened, but he moved half a step. Emily lifted the phone mounted inside the shack and dialed the records office. Her eyes stayed on Thomas through the glass. He had not moved. He looked less like a visitor waiting for permission and more like a memory the base had failed to recognize. The line clicked. A clerk answered, casual and tired. Emily spoke each word clearly. "This is Sergeant Carter at Gate 3. I need verification on a veteran identification card. Name, Thomas Edward Whitaker." The keyboard on the other end began to tap. Then stopped. "Sergeant," the clerk said after a pause, "can you repeat that name?" Emily did. The silence that followed was longer than it should have been. The clerk on the line did not come back with an answer. He came back with caution. Emily heard papers move, then a chair scrape, then the faint sound of another voice in the records office asking why the terminal had locked. "Sergeant Carter," the clerk said, no longer casual, "that name is not in the standard veteran access list." Miller's mouth tightened into a satisfied line. "There it is," he said under his breath. Emily raised one hand to silence him. "What does the system show?" she asked. The clerk hesitated. "It shows a restricted file marker." Emily watched Thomas through the glass. He stood in the same place, the wooden box steady in his hands, the wind pressing his faded jacket against his narrow frame. "What level?" Emily asked. Another pause. "Longer this time. I cannot open that from here." Miller stepped closer to the shack window. Because it is fake. The clerk heard him and answered before Emily could. No, Corporal. Because my terminal does not have the clearance. The words changed the temperature at gate 3. The second guard straightened. The contractor in the pickup stopped looking impatient. Even the fuel truck driver leaned out of his cab, pretending not to listen. Miller looked at the scanner, then at Thomas, then back toward Emily as if the morning had started speaking a language he did not know. Emily kept her voice measured. Can you search by call sign? The clerk exhaled. If you have one. Emily looked at the box again. The gray cloth had slipped lower now, showing the carved letters in full. They looked older than the gate, older than the guard shack, older than Miller's certainty. Raven 6, she said. On the other end, the keyboard began again. 3 taps. Then nothing. The line went so quiet that Emily could hear the tiny electric hum inside the receiver. Records, she said. The clerk's voice returned softer. Sergeant, who is standing at your gate? Emily did not answer immediately. Her eyes stayed on Thomas Whitaker. His face gave away nothing. Not pride. Not worry. Not relief. It was the face of a man who had learned long ago that truth did not become stronger just because someone shouted it. An elderly veteran requesting to see General Harrington, Emily said. He is carrying a wooden box marked Raven 6 and Dak Ridge. The clerk whispered something away from the phone. A second voice answered. Then a third. The records office, which had been half asleep 5 minutes earlier, was suddenly awake. Sergeant, the clerk said, do not let anyone handle that box. Emily's grip tightened on the receiver. Is it dangerous? No. I mean, I do not know. I mean, the instruction attached to the call sign says preserve all personal effects and notify command authority immediately. Miller's face flushed. Command authority? For an old box. Emily looked at him, and this time there was no patience in her eyes. Corporal, step outside and keep the lane clear. Sergeant, with respect, I initiated this security stop. And now I am continuing it. Miller swallowed the argument, but not the resentment. He stepped out from the shack and moved toward Thomas, stopping closer than necessary. Looks like you bought yourself a little time, he said. Thomas looked past him, not through him, but beyond him, as if Miller were standing in front of a door that history had already opened. Time was never mine to buy, Thomas said. I only borrowed some. Miller did not understand the sentence, and that bothered him more than an insult would have. He turned toward the growing line of vehicles and waved the contractor truck into a side lane. The driver obeyed slowly, eyes still fixed on Thomas. A couple of junior soldiers had gathered near the fence inside the gate, drawn by the stalled traffic and the strange stillness at the checkpoint. One lifted a phone halfway, then lowered it when Emily stepped out of the shack and gave him a look sharp enough to cut the habit out of him. No recording, she said. Not here. The junior soldier put the phone away. Thomas noticed. For the first time, a faint shadow of approval crossed his face, gone almost before it arrived. Emily walked back to him, holding his identification card with both hands now, not because it was fragile, but because it had become important. Mr. Whitaker, she said, the records office is escalating the verification. They will have trouble. Why? His eyes shifted to the base beyond the barrier. Morning sunlight touched the tops of the low buildings, turning windows into hard squares of white. Because some doors were closed by men who are no longer alive to open them. Emily felt that sentence settle into the air. Miller heard it too, but chose to scoff. That is a nice line. Thomas turned to him slowly. It was not meant to be nice. The chain on the flagpole clicked again. 3 times. Then the loudspeaker inside Fort Holden gave a short warning tone for the morning drill. The sound was sudden, metallic, and loud enough to make the second guard flinch. Miller blinked. The soldiers near the fence shifted. But Thomas did not move. He did not brace. He did not glance around. He simply tilted his head half an inch, listening through the tone as if separating one note from another. Emily saw it. She saw the way his feet were placed, angled away from the open lane, balanced without effort. She saw his left hand protect the box while his right stayed free, relaxed, disciplined. She saw an old scar disappear beneath the cuff of his jacket. None of it was proof. All of it was evidence. The phone inside the shack rang again. Emily picked it up before the second ring finished. This time the voice was not the clerk. It was lower, older, and far more careful. "Sergeant Carter, this is Captain Nolan from headquarters staff. Confirm the man at your gate gave the name Thomas Edward Whitaker." Emily looked at Thomas. "Confirmed." "Confirm the marking Raven 6. "Confirmed." Another silence. Then Captain Nolan said, "Sergeant, listen very carefully. You will treat Mr. Whitaker as an honored guest. You will not open the box. You will not challenge his service again. And you will inform Corporal Miller that the phrase fake veteran is not to be repeated at that gate." Emily's eyes moved to Miller. His face had gone still. She did not need to put the call on speaker. The shame had already found him. Captain Nolan did not raise his voice, and that made the order heavier. Emily repeated it once, not for herself, but for the young corporal standing 6 feet away with his shoulders locked and his pride draining out of him in slow, visible degrees. "Mr. Whitaker is to be treated as an honored guest. The box is not to be opened. His service is not to be challenged again." The words crossed the cold air and found every person at gate 3. The second guard looked down at his boots. The junior soldiers near the fence stood straighter. The contractor in the side lane removed his cap without seeming to realize he had done it. Miller's face tightened, not with anger now, but with the first shape of doubt. Doubt was worse for him than being corrected. Correction had an enemy. Doubt had a mirror. Thomas Whitaker stood where he had stood from the beginning, just outside the yellow line, holding the wooden box against the front of his faded jacket. He did not look satisfied. He did not look vindicated. He looked almost weary, as if respect arriving late still carried the weight of the insult that came before it. Emily ended the call and stepped out of the shack. The wind moved across the asphalt, lifting a line of dust and dry leaves along the curb. Above them, the flag snapped once, sharp as a hand clap, then settled back into its restless rhythm. "Mr. Whitaker," Emily said, "I apologize for the delay." Thomas gave a small nod. "You were doing your job." Miller looked up at that. The sentence should have helped him. Somehow it did not. Emily handed Thomas the identification card with both hands. "Headquarters is notifying command staff. They ask that we keep you here until General Harrington can be reached." Thomas placed the card back inside his jacket. His hand passed over the old scar near his wrist, a pale line that vanished beneath the cuff. Emily saw Miller notice it too. The corporal's eyes flicked away. Quickly, as if the scar had accused him without saying a word. "There is a chair inside," Emily offered. "Coffee if you want it." Thomas looked toward the guard shack window, then toward the base road beyond the barrier. "I will stand." It was not stubbornness. It was ceremony. Emily understood that before she knew why. He had not come to wait in comfort. He had come to finish something that had waited too long already. Miller shifted his weight. His new gloves creaked faintly. "Sir," he began, and the word sounded unfamiliar in his mouth, "I did not know." Thomas turned to him slowly. "Most people do not." The answer was not forgiveness, but it was not punishment either. That made it harder to receive. Miller swallowed. The system showed access denied. Machines know what they are told, Thomas said. Not always what happened. The second guard glanced at the scanner, still glowing red beside the window. A few minutes earlier, that red light had felt final. Now it looked small. Emily stepped closer to Thomas, lowering her voice enough that only he could hear. May I ask what is inside the box? Thomas's eyes moved down to the gray cloth. His thumb rested along the carved edge where the letters Raven 6 had been worn dark by years of touch. For several seconds he said nothing. Beyond the fence, a formation of soldiers crossed a road in the distance, their boots moving in even rhythm, their voices rising and falling in a cadence that belonged to the living. Thomas listened until it faded. A promise, he said. Emily waited. Thomas did not add more. He did not owe the gate his history. Not yet. Inside the shack, the phone rang again. Everyone turned toward it. This time even Miller did not move first. Emily picked it up. Gate 3, Sergeant Carter. A different voice came through, clipped and official. Sergeant, this is Major Ellis from the Commanding General's office. Confirm visual contact with Mr. Thomas Edward Whitaker. Emily looked through the glass. Thomas stood in the cold light, plain as a man waiting for a bus, impossible as a name rising from a sealed file. Confirmed. Does he have the Raven 6 item in his possession? Confirmed. The Major exhaled, and something in that breath told Emily the office upstairs had just changed shape. Chairs had moved. Doors had opened. People were no longer speaking casually. Sergeant, General Harrington is en route to your location. Emily's eyes lifted. To Gate 3. Directly to Gate 3. Miller heard it. His posture changed again, this time not from discipline, but from disbelief. Generals did not come to service gates. Generals sent aides. Generals summoned people inside. Generals did not leave headquarters because an old man with worn boots had been stopped by a corporal. Emily kept the receiver close. Estimated arrival. Now, the Major said. The line clicked dead. For one breath, no one moved. Then the sound came from inside the base, tires moving fast over clean pavement, not reckless, but urgent. A black command sport utility vehicle appeared beyond the inner turn, followed by a second vehicle. The barrier arm was still down. The red scanner still blinked. The wind still tapped the chain against the flagpole. Thomas finally shifted his feet. Not backward. Not forward. Just enough to stand a little straighter. Emily saw his face change for the first time. Not fear. Not pride. Recognition. Miller followed his gaze down the road as the vehicles approached, and the last of his certainty left him. Thomas Whitaker adjusted the gray cloth over the wooden box, covering the carved words as if preparing to place memory into the hands it had been waiting for. The lead vehicle stopped 20 feet from the barrier. The rear door opened before the driver could step out. General William Harrington emerged into the morning cold without his cover on, eyes already fixed on the old man at the gate. General William Harrington did not hurry, but every man at Gate 3 felt the speed of his arrival. He stepped from the black command sport utility vehicle into the cold morning with his coat open at the front and his face set in a silence that moved ahead of him like weather. Major Ellis followed 2 steps behind, carrying a folder that had clearly been opened too fast and read too little. The driver remained by the vehicle. The second sport utility vehicle stopped. Farther back, and 2 staff officers climbed out, then froze when they saw the scene at the barrier, one elderly man outside the line, one young corporal inside it, one sergeant standing between procedure and something older than procedure. Miller snapped to attention so sharply his boots struck the asphalt. "Sir," he said, voice tight. General Harrington did not answer him. His eyes were fixed on Thomas Whitaker. Not on the box first. Not on the old jacket. Not on the outdated card now resting inside Thomas's pocket. On his face. Harrington slowed 3 paces from the yellow line, as if the distance itself had become sacred ground. For a moment he looked like a man seeing a photograph step out of a frame. Thomas stood straighter, but he did not salute. His hands remained around the wooden box. The gray cloth moved slightly in the wind, and the carved corner showed again, Raven 6. Harrington saw it. Emily saw his expression change. It was small, almost hidden, but unmistakable. The command in his face gave way to something personal. Something carried from a room, from a story, from a father's voice spoken years ago at a kitchen table when the house was quiet and the old ghosts were near. "Mr. Whittaker," Harrington said. His voice was low. Thomas answered with the same restraint. "General." Harrington swallowed once. Behind him, Major Ellis looked down at the folder, then back up, as though the paper had failed to prepare him for the man. Miller's eyes shifted between them, trying to understand why the commanding general of Fort Halden was standing at a service gate in the morning cold, speaking to a man he had almost detained as if rank itself had stepped aside. Harrington looked at the box. "My father said you would come one day." Thomas's grip tightened by the smallest measure. "I told him I would, if I lived long enough." The word settled over the gate like snowfall. No one moved. Even the engine seemed quieter. Emily felt the story widen around her, not with noise, but with meaning. Harrington took one step closer. "He kept your name in our house," he said. "Not in public. Not in speeches. At home. He said some names were not meant for applause. They were meant for remembering correctly." Thomas lowered his eyes. The wind lifted his white hair from his forehead. For a second he looked less like an old man and more like someone standing at the edge of two different mornings, one at Fort Halden and one decades behind him. "Your father was a good officer," Thomas said. Harrington's jaw moved slightly. "He said he became an old officer because of you." Miller's face went pale. The second guard looked straight ahead, ashamed to have witnessed what he had not understood. Emily kept her hands folded in front of her, but inside her chest something had tightened. She had heard soldiers speak of honor before. In ceremonies. In retirement halls. In speeches polished until they shone. This was different. This was honor arriving without music, wearing an old jacket and carrying a box wrapped in gray cloth. Harrington looked toward the barrier arm. It was still down. The scanner beside the shack still glowed red, still insisting that access was denied. The general stared at the red light for one long second. Then he turned his head toward Miller. "Corporal." Miller stepped forward half an inch. "Sir." "Raise the gate." Miller hesitated only because his mind was still catching up with his body. Then he moved to the control panel. His gloved hand shook once before he pressed the button. The barrier arm lifted with a low electric hum. The sound was ordinary. The moment was not. Harrington turned back to Thomas, but Thomas did not cross. Not yet. The old man looked at the open lane, then at the general, then down at the box. "Before I come in," Thomas said, "you should know why I brought it." Harrington's face softened in a way that made him look suddenly younger and older at once. "I think I know part of it." Thomas shook his head. "Only part." He carefully unfolded the gray cloth from the top of the wooden box. The wood beneath was dark from age, its corners worn smooth by hands that had not forgotten. There was no decoration except the carved words and a small brass latch dulled almost black. Thomas did not open it. He only rested his palm over the lid. "Your father gave me something at Dak Ridge," he said. "He asked me to return it if his son ever wore stars." Harrington looked down at the silver stars on his uniform, then back at Thomas. The gate was open. The base was waiting. But every person there understood that Thomas Whittaker was not the one seeking permission anymore. Thomas did not open the wooden box at the gate, but the moment his palm touched the lid, the years behind it seemed to rise through the cold air. The flag chain clicked against the pole, and for Thomas Whittaker, that small metallic sound became another sound from another place, long ago, when he was not 72 and white-haired, but 27, lean, sunburned, and carrying a radio that never seemed to stop whispering through static. Dak Ridge had not looked important on a map. Just a rough line of high ground, scrub trees, red dirt, and heat that made the horizon shake. But men remembered places differently than maps did. Maps did not remember fear held behind closed teeth. Maps did not remember wet socks, empty canteens, and the quiet jokes men told when they were trying not to think about home. Thomas had been called Raven 6 there, not because he wanted a name, but because every man in that small reconnaissance team needed something shorter than hope to answer when the radio cracked alive. Lieutenant Robert Harrington had been young then, younger than his son was now, with the same hard eyes and the same habit of listening before he spoke. He carried a small photograph of a boy in a baseball cap tucked inside his field notebook. William, age 7, missing one front tooth, grinning beside a bicycle with training wheels. Thomas had seen that photograph only once, when a gust of mountain wind flipped the notebook open during a long wait under a gray sky. Robert had smiled, embarrassed by his own softness. "He thinks stars are something you wish on," he had said. "Maybe one day he will learn they are something you have to carry." Thomas had not answered then. Some truths did not need company. The memory shifted, as memories do, not in order, but in fragments. A ridge line blurred by rain. A compass pressed flat against a knee. Radio static. Robert Harrington's voice, steady even when the plan had fallen apart. Men moving through darkness by touch and trust. No glory. No speeches. No brass band waiting on the other side. Just the old rule that mattered more than any printed order: you did not leave your people behind in the forgotten places. Thomas remembered Robert giving him the small object now resting inside the box. Not a medal meant for display. Not a trophy. A simple personal insignia, worn smooth at the edges, wrapped in a scrap of cloth and pressed into Thomas's hand with a promise attached to it. Robert had been exhausted, his face pale beneath the dirt, but his voice had stayed clear. "If my boy ever wears stars," he had said, "tell him they were paid for by men whose names he may never hear." Thomas had tried to refuse. Robert had closed his fingers around it anyway. "Then make him hear one," he had said. The memory faded with the sound of the flag chain at gate 3. Click. 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 Thomas blinked once and returned to the cold morning, to the raised barrier, to the young corporal who had not known enough to be humble, and to the general standing before him with his father's eyes. Harrington seemed to understand that Thomas had gone somewhere far away without moving an inch. He did not interrupt. Neither did Emily. Even Miller stayed silent, because some silences warned a man not to step on them. Thomas looked down at the box. "Your father did not ask me to tell you what happened," he said. "He asked me to tell you what mattered." Harrington's voice was almost a whisper. "And what mattered?" Thomas lifted his eyes. "That command is not the same as rank. Rank is pinned on. Command is what men trust when the dark gets quiet." The word struck Harrington harder than any ceremony could have. His face tightened, not from embarrassment, but from recognition. He had spent his life wearing stars. Now one of the men from his father's stories stood before him, reminding him what those stars were supposed to weigh. Miller stared at the asphalt. The red scanner light still blinked beside him, stubborn and useless. Emily watched Thomas with the stillness of someone realizing she was witnessing a handoff between generations. Thomas slid one thumb along the brass latch but still did not open it. "I carried this for 51 years, he said. "Not because I wanted to keep it. Because I was waiting for the right hands." Harrington slowly removed his service cap from under his arm and held it against his side. The gesture was small, but every soldier at the gate understood it. He was not receiving a visitor. He was receiving a debt. Thomas took one careful step forward, crossing the yellow line at last. No alarm sounded. No one stopped him. The base did not reject him now. It seemed to make room. He held the box out toward General Harrington, and the wind dropped for one clean second, as if even the morning wanted to hear what came next. General Harrington did not reach for the wooden box right away. He looked at Thomas Whitaker's hands first, at the age in them, at the pale scar near the wrist, at the careful way they held the weight of 51 years without complaint. Then he looked at the carved words beneath the gray cloth, and his face changed again. Not enough for a civilian to notice, maybe, but enough for every soldier at Gate 3 to feel it. The general was not standing before an old visitor now. He was standing before the missing half of a story that had shaped his entire life. "My father never told me everything," Harrington said. Thomas gave the faintest nod. "He was right not to. He told me enough to know the name Raven 6. Thomas's thumb rested on the brass latch. "Then he told you more than most." The general swallowed. The morning sun had climbed over the low buildings of Fort Holden, cutting clean lines of light across the asphalt. The raised barrier arm cast a long shadow between them, like a border that no longer had authority. Major Ellis stood behind Harrington with the folder lowered at his side. He had stopped pretending paper could explain what was happening. Emily Carter watched from near the guard shack, her breath slow, her eyes fixed on Thomas. Miller stood to her right, rigid and pale, every second stretching the shame wider across his face. Thomas lowered the box slightly and turned it so Harrington could see the latch. "He gave this to me after we came off Dak Ridge," Thomas said. "He said if his boy ever wore stars, I should bring it back." Harrington's voice roughened. "Why did you wait so long?" Thomas looked past him toward the base. A group of soldiers had stopped at a distance, not close enough to intrude, but close enough to understand that something rare was happening. "Because your father asked me to wait until the stars meant something." Harrington absorbed that in silence. It was not an insult. It was heavier than an insult. It was a measure. Thomas continued. "A man can rise fast in the army. He can collect titles, offices, parking spaces with his name on them. But stars are not decoration. They are a burden. I had to know you had learned that before I placed this in your hands." Miller glanced at Harrington, expecting offense. None came. The general only lowered his eyes, as if the old man had named a truth he had spent years trying to earn. "And have I?" Harrington asked. Thomas studied him for a long moment. The wind pressed the cloth against the box. The flag snapped once behind them. No one at the gate breathed loudly. "I watched your first memorial speech online," Thomas said. "You named every enlisted man before you named a single officer." Harrington blinked, surprised. "You saw that?" "I have been old, General. Not dead." A soft, nervous laugh moved through the people gathered there, but it faded quickly because Thomas did not smile. "That was when I knew," he said. Harrington nodded once, slowly, like a man receiving both comfort and judgment. Thomas turned the box back toward himself. With his right hand, he lifted the brass latch. The sound was small. Just a click. But at Gate 3 it carried farther than a command. He opened the lid. Inside was a folded piece of dark blue cloth, a tarnished officer insignia, and an envelope yellowed by age, sealed but not forgotten. No weapon. No danger. Nothing that should have frightened the checkpoint. Only memory. Only proof. Only the kind of debt no scanner could read. Harrington looked at the insignia and his face went still. "That was his," he said. Thomas nodded. "He took it off before the evacuation flight. Said he wanted you to have it when you understood what it cost to wear anything on your chest." Harrington reached out, then stopped himself. His fingers hovered above the box but did not touch it. "May I?" he asked. The question moved through the gate harder than any order he had given that morning. A 4-star general asking permission from an old man in worn boots. Thomas looked at him, then gave a small nod. Harrington lifted the insignia with both hands. The metal caught the sunlight for a brief second, dull and bright at once. His shoulders lowered, as if some private weight had finally found its name. Emily saw his eyes shine, but he did not look away. Miller saw it too, and something inside him seemed to fold. He had asked what was in the box like it was a problem to be solved. Now he understood it had been a sanctuary he had nearly profaned. Harrington held the insignia against his palm and looked at Thomas. My father said there were men who carried him when he could not carry himself. Thomas closed the box halfway, leaving the letter inside. He carried others before that. Do not forget that part. Harrington drew a slow breath. Then, without warning, he stepped back one pace. His heels came together. His spine straightened. The whole gate seemed to recognize the movement before the hand rose. General William Harrington raised his right hand to his brow and saluted Thomas Whittaker. The salute held the morning still. It was not the quick salute of passing officers near a headquarters door. It was not the automatic salute of routine. General William Harrington held his hand at his brow as if the entire weight of Fort Halden had narrowed to the old man standing before him. Thomas Whittaker did not move at first. His hands rested on the wooden box. His shoulders were straight, but his eyes had gone somewhere quiet. Every soldier at Gate 3 understood that they were watching something larger than rank. The commanding general was saluting a man with no visible medals, no polished shoes, no formal invitation, and a veteran identification card the machine had rejected in red letters. The base had said access denied. The general was saying something else. Slowly, Thomas shifted the box into the crook of his left arm. His right hand rose. It was not fast. Age had taken speed from him, but not precision. His fingers touched his brow with a discipline so old and clean that even Miller felt it in his chest. For several seconds the two men held the salute across the yellow line, one wearing stars, one carrying memory. Then Thomas lowered his hand. Harrington lowered his after him. No one spoke until the wind moved again. Harrington turned toward the gathered guards, staff officers, and junior soldiers by the fence. His voice did not rise, but it carried with perfect clarity. This man's name is Thomas Edward Whittaker. Some of you saw a worn jacket. Some of you saw an old card. Some of you trusted a screen before you trusted your own sense of respect. Miller's jaw tightened. He did not look away. He deserved the words, and he knew it. Harrington continued. You will remember what happened here. Not because a regulation was broken. It was not. Security matters. Verification matters. But there is a line between caution and contempt, and no soldier under my command will confuse the two. The word struck Miller harder than a shouted reprimand could have. Emily Carter stood still beside the shack, feeling both the correction and the mercy inside it. Harrington looked directly at Miller now. Corporal Miller. Miller stepped forward. Sir. You challenged access. That was your duty. But you challenged a man's honor before you understood what you were holding in your hands. Miller swallowed. Yes, sir. Do you understand the difference? Miller looked at Thomas. The old man did not stare him down. That made the shame worse. Thomas simply waited, as if giving him room to become better than the mistake. I do now, sir, Miller said. Harrington nodded once. Then say it to him. Miller turned fully toward Thomas. His new gloves no longer looked sharp. They looked too clean. Mr. Whittaker, he said, voice lower than before, I was wrong. I treated you with disrespect. I called your service into question without knowing who you were, and I am sorry. Thomas studied him. The gate was quiet enough for everyone to hear the flag rope ticking against the pole. Finally, Thomas said, you should question what comes through a gate. Miller lifted his eyes. Thomas continued, but never use the gate to make yourself taller than the man standing outside it. Miller nodded slowly. Yes, sir. Thomas's expression softened by the smallest degree. Learn that early, and you will save yourself from becoming the kind of man who needs rank to feel strong. No one smiled. No one needed to. The lesson had landed exactly where it belonged. Harrington looked at Emily. Sergeant Carter. Sir. You noticed what others missed. Emily kept her face composed, but her eyes shifted once to the carved box. I almost missed it too, sir. Almost is not the same as failure. Harrington turned back to Thomas. Would you allow me to escort you inside? Thomas glanced at the open barrier, the road beyond it, the buildings waking under the pale sun. After 51 years, the base looked both strange and familiar. New pavement. New cameras. New uniforms. But the same flag. The same wind. The same young faces learning too late that history often arrives without announcing itself. Yes, General, Thomas said. Harrington stepped aside, not ahead of him. That small choice moved through the watching soldiers like a silent command. The general would not lead Thomas in as a visitor. He would walk beside him as a witness. Thomas closed the box gently, leaving the letter inside untouched for now. Miller moved to the control panel and kept the barrier raised. As Thomas passed him, Miller stood at attention. This time, there was no performance in it. Only respect. Thomas paused beside him. Corporal. Sir. The next old man who comes to your gate may not have a general coming for him. Miller's throat moved. I understand. Thomas looked ahead again. Then be careful how you send him away. With that, Thomas Whitaker crossed into Fort Halden, and every soldier at Gate 3 stood a little straighter as he passed. Thomas Whitaker walked through Gate 3 with the wooden box held close and General Harrington beside him, not ahead of him, not behind him, but shoulder to shoulder. That was what the soldiers remembered later. Not the vehicles. Not the staff officers. Not the red scanner light that had failed to understand the man in front of it. They remembered the way a general adjusted his pace to match an old veteran's careful steps. The road inside Fort Halden stretched a quarter-mile toward the headquarters building, lined with low brick offices, trimmed grass, and flag markers moving in the cold wind. Word traveled faster than the command vehicles. By the time Thomas reached the first intersection, soldiers had stopped along the sidewalks. Mechanics stepped out of a maintenance bay. A clerk paused at a doorway with papers still in her hand. No one had been ordered to stand there. No one had been told to salute. Still, as Thomas passed, hands rose one by one. Quietly. Carefully. Like a wave made of respect instead of sound. Thomas did not look left or right at first. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, but Emily Carter, walking several paces behind with Major Ellis, saw the way his jaw tightened. Some honors arrive too late to feel easy. Some bring back the names of men who should have been walking beside you. Harrington led him into the headquarters building through the side entrance, away from the polished lobby. They entered a hall lined with photographs from decades of service. Some were sharp and new. Others had faded at the corners. Near the second-floor conference room, Thomas stopped before a small shadow box beneath frosted glass. Emily recognized it now. Classified valor. Below the words was an old photograph of young men standing under a washed-out sky. Their faces were grainy, their uniforms faded by time, but one figure near the back had Thomas's eyes. Harrington stood beside him. My father used to stop here whenever he visited the base, he said. Thomas studied the photograph. He always stood like he was listening to something far away. Harrington looked at him. He did that until the day he died. Thomas nodded once, as if the answer had reached a place inside him that had been waiting years for it. In the conference room, Harrington placed the tarnished insignia on a clean blue cloth, but Thomas kept the sealed envelope in the box. "That letter is for you alone," Thomas said. "Not for a display case." Harrington accepted the boundary without question. He picked up the envelope with both hands and read the handwriting on the front. "William, when the stars become heavy." The general closed his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them, the room was silent. Thomas latched the wooden box and rested his palm on the lid. "Your father wanted you to remember the men whose names did not make the wall," he said. "Not because they needed praise. Because a country gets careless when it forgets who carried it." Harrington nodded slowly. "They will be remembered here." "Do not remember them only here," Thomas said. "Remember them when a tired man stands at your gate and does not look important." Down at Gate 3, Corporal Miller remained at his post. The traffic had cleared. The scanner light had gone back to its normal green. Everything looked ordinary again, which somehow made the morning feel even heavier. Miller checked every identification card with a different voice now. Firm, but not sharp. Careful, but not proud. When an older maintenance worker approached without his badge visible, Miller did not bark. He simply said, "Good morning, sir. May I help you?" Sergeant Emily Carter heard it from the shack and said nothing. Some corrections did not need applause. Near noon, Thomas Whitaker left Fort Halden the same way he had entered, on foot, through Gate 3. This time the barrier rose before he reached the yellow line. Miller stepped out and stood at attention. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, "safe travels." Thomas paused. The cold had softened into a pale afternoon, and the flag above the shack moved gently now. He looked at the young corporal for a long moment. "Guard the gate well," he said. Miller nodded. "I will." Thomas adjusted his old olive jacket and walked toward the road beyond the base, empty-handed at last. Behind him, in a quiet room inside headquarters, a general sat alone with a letter from his father. At the gate, a young soldier watched an old man disappear into the sunlight and understood that some salutes are not given to rank. They are given to memory.